So I am starting a new sermon series. This is one of three messages, if the Lord should keep it at three or let it be three. But this series is on God as our deliverer. And we're looking at God's deliverance in our lives and our need for it and what He's done for us. Today's message is specifically deliverance from Egypt. So in the book of Genesis, we are told about Jacob and his sons, Joseph being the 11th and the firstborn to his wife Rachel. Now, I'm going to be covering a lot of ground, so we're not going to be reading all of these accounts. I'm going to summarize quite a bit of it until the portions that we're going to focus on. But just to bring us up to speed, Joseph was given a coat that had multiple colors in it. He had some dreams that he shared with his brothers that caused his brothers to become jealous to the point that they sold him into slavery to Egypt, to go on into Egypt. And while he was in Egypt, and this is his brothers, I think, capturing him to sell him into Egypt, but God gives Joseph some interpretations to some dreams that other people have had. One of those other people being Pharaoh, that led to Joseph being promoted from being a slave to being the second in charge of all of Egypt. Only Pharaoh reserved his seat to be above Joseph, but he said, other than me, Joseph is the guy. He's the person that we're all going to be listening to because of God's favor on him. Now, historians and Bible scholars date this event that this took place to be somewhere around the 19th century before Christ. And it's interesting because there is a tomb of a person named Numhotep II. Now, he as a person was the equivalent of a governor in Egypt around that time period that this would have been taking place. And they discovered inside his tomb there is this mural, and this is actually an image of that mural that they found. But in this mural, they find these pictures of these nomads, and it says in Egyptian, it's labeled in Egyptian, this mural is nomads from Syria/Palestine. In other words, these are nomads from where the Hebrews had migrated from to Egypt. So they're coming, and there's the women, there is the men, there is the children, and they have livestock with them, and all of this is going on in this image. Now, the Pharaoh at that time period, his name was Senusret II. And Senusret II, interestingly, because let me just back up a second to remind you of the story of Joseph. The dream that Joseph interpreted for Pharaoh included the idea that there was going to be an abundant harvest for a while, but then there was going to be a great famine. And with that, Joseph told Pharaoh, what you need to do is you need to hold on to your grain, have people contribute grain to you during the time of plenty so that you can store it into these bins so that when the famine comes, you'll be able to pull from it and you'll be able to survive the famine. That's the reason why Senusret, this Pharaoh, placed Joseph in charge of this agricultural project to be able to save up the grain and store it. So interestingly enough, this Pharaoh that again was the same time period of when the Israelites would have came there. He is actually known for his major agricultural projects. And of course, this is Pharaoh and Joseph speaking here. But his legacy, what this particular Pharaoh was known for, was his ag projects, which, if you go by the Exodus account, it was actually Joseph's ag projects that perhaps he took credit for, since he was the Pharaoh at the time. So we see that there is actually historical evidence of the Hebrews moving into Egypt, or at least people that came from their area that happened to move there, under a Pharaoh that happened to be known for this ag project that the Bible tells us Joseph had brought into the area and helped them with. So we fast forward, and Joseph and all that he did for Pharaoh, including a fantastic ag program, storing this grain, literally saving Egypt, as well as the Hebrews in the process. Despite all of that, we find that later he gets forgotten. So we're going to read Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 14. It says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt." So a lot of time had passed. Joseph was passed away. That entire generation has passed away that came there, that had a very good relationship with Egypt at first. They're all gone. So now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So here's some more fun archaeology for you. This is another mural. This one is found in a tomb belonging to Reckmeyer, who lived under two different pharaohs, a pharaoh named Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. They found depictions in his mural of slaves making bricks. It shows the entire brick-making process, and a person overseeing them with a rod in his hand striking one of the slaves. I think you see that part of that in the lower right-hand side. This lines up with the biblical timeline as to the pharaohs most likely being the Exodus pharaohs. It may have been Thutmose, it may have been Amenhotep. It's hard to know for sure which of those, because you're dealing in estimations of time is the best they can do. But as they estimate it, these two particular pharaohs, their reigns coincide with the time that this happened. And of course, we understand when we read the book of Exodus, we understand that brick making was something that the Hebrews were forced to do. So here's some more archaeological evidence. This is Egyptian. This isn't the Bible. This isn't something the Hebrews put together. This was something that the Egyptian that was around that time period had painted inside of his tomb that he would be laid to rest in. And it depicts them making this straw. And there's also a writing that talks about how they had a lot of straw and then they didn't have very much straw. And it coincides with the declaration that the Hebrews were to go out and get their own straw to make the bricks. But they had a quota. And there's documentation in Egypt that said that they had to make 2,000 bricks a day. This meant getting the mud, getting the straw, putting it together in wooden molds, taking it out and letting it bake in the sun. And you had to do that by 2,000 every day, or you were had consequences for that, some very severe consequences that would happen. Now, incidentally, and we'll get to this part later, neither of these pharaohs here were followed by their firstborn son. You see, Thutmose the third, his firstborn son died. That is why Amenhotep became pharaoh, because Thutmose's firstborn son had died. As a result, Amenhotep, who was the second-born, ended up being the next pharaoh. And then interestingly, Amenhotep the second, his firstborn child, we know, also died. Both of them lost their firstborn child. As a matter of fact, a young boy around 10 years old is mummified in Amenhotep II's tomb. It's hard to know if that was his older brother or if that was his child. They really don't know the connection there. What they know is this mummy, his head was shaved, and he had a single lock of hair that was braided, that was grown out, which is consistent with how they would identify the next pharaoh. So they know this 10-year-old boy was supposed to be pharaoh, but he had died. So either he was Amenhotep's older brother or he was Amenhotep's son. But we know that both of those pharaohs that were around the time of the Exodus, both of those pharaohs lost their firstborn son. And if you know the story, you understand the connection, and we'll get to that. But God calls Moses to lead Israel out of their bondage. He raises up this man, Moses, to be a deliverer of the Hebrew people out of Egypt. You see, Moses is a type of Christ. He was a foreshadow that showed us what it was that Jesus would one day do for us. Of course, Jesus isn't known as Jesus at this time. He's actually Yahweh. He's very much involved in the world. He's very much God. However, he raises up Moses to lead the people of Israel out of their bondage. And as we go through the Exodus story, we find that God does not merely save his people, but he reveals himself as the only true God and exposes all of the false gods in Egypt. And understanding that Israel was enslaved under a false god king, because Pharaoh himself declared himself and was believed by Egyptians. Their worldview was that Pharaoh wasn't just king, but Pharaoh was God, or a god, one of many gods. But he was a god. He was the son of Ra, not just a ruler, but deity. In their bondage in Egypt, it was a physical bondage, but there was something much more sinister than that. But there is a spiritual bondage as well that was going on. Exodus 1:13 said, "So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves." You see, God raised up a deliverer in Moses, like I said, who is a messianic figure. Deuteronomy 18:15 through 18 tells us this: "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me," this is Moses speaking, "from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen, just as you desired of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, 'Let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, or see this great fire any more, lest I die.' And the Lord said to me, 'They are right in what they have spoken. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him." Jesus is revealed as being this prophet that came, that is a prophet like Moses. But rather, Moses was the forerunner. Jesus was the fulfiller. Jesus is who it was really all about. Acts 3:22 through 23. Moses said, "The Lord God will raise up for you a prophet like me for your brothers. You shall listen to him in whatever he tells you, and it shall be that every soul who does not listen to that prophet shall be destroyed from the people." In this passage, they were talking about Jesus being that prophet. So we see that Moses is a type of Christ. He foreshadowed Jesus. And Moses goes before, possibly Amenhotep II, and he commands that he let his people go. You're familiar, perhaps, if you've not read the account, maybe you've seen the movie. But the command is refused, and this refusal is actually God ordained, because God had a plan in his competition, if you would call it that, against Pharaoh. Rather, God would be able to reveal himself as superior to all of the false gods in Egypt. The plagues, you see, were a direct attack on the Egyptian gods. So Moses would go to Pharaoh. I really believe it's this Amenhotep. I believe the archaeology kind of brings that out in the account. But he goes to him and he says, "Let my people go." And then Pharaoh says, "No, I'm not going to let your people go." And then God brings a plague. After that plague, Moses goes back and says, "Let my people go." Pharaoh says, "I won't let your people go." And God brings forth another plague. And he does this 10 times. However, each and every one of these plagues were not random. God wasn't just coming up with random ideas to make life miserable in Egypt, but rather each of these plagues are actually tied to specific gods, some of them multiple gods, meant to kind of be an insult or an offense or evidence that the one true God, Yahweh, was God, and that all the gods of Egypt could not compete or compare with him. Similar to what God does with Elijah when Elijah confronts the worshipers and the priests of Baal, and he shows God to be superior because God came down and consumed the sacrifice by fire, and the prophets of Baal were not able to call that fire down themselves. Likewise, that is what we see going on here. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at the plagues real quickly. We're going to read about them in a little bit, but I want us to just look at them quickly. The first one is the Nile being turned into blood. And that particular one, there was 3 different gods that would have insulted. The first one is the god of the Nile. He is named Happy, H-A-P-I, not like he's happy, but H-A-P-I. Now, something that I've noticed about Happy, if you look real closely, apparently I have the body of a god. It could be said. Happy apparently had a dad bod. But he is the god of the Nile, responsible for its annual flooding. The turning of the Nile's water to blood would have been seen as an attack on his domain. There is also K-H-N-U-N, N-U-M, I don't know how to say that, Knom. He is the ram-headed god, and he was believed to be the guardian of the Nile's source. And then you had Osiris, who is the god of the underworld, with the Nile sometimes being considered his bloodstream. So all of these 3 gods had connections with the Nile, and yet God turns the Nile into blood, showing that Yahweh is the one who has authority over the Nile. The next plague was the plague of frogs. This god's name is Heket. Heket was the frog-headed goddess of fertility and childbirth. The plague of frogs not only made Heket appear powerless, but turned her sacred animal into a nuisance and a source of decay. Then there was a plague of lice, and this is Geb. Geb is the god of the earth, the dust of the earth. His domain was turned into lice or gnats, a symbolic attack on his power. The 4th plague is flies. This is Khepri. Khepri was the god of creation. He was often depicted as a scarab beetle. In Egypt, the scarab is kind of a sacred thing. The scarab, in case you didn't know, is also known as the dung beetle. This is the beetle that goes and finds, excrement and rolls it into a little tiny ball. And the Egyptians witnessed this. They watched this beetle doing this, and in their minds, they said, this is similar to what Khepri does, because in their mind, Khepri rolls out the sun every day, every morning, and it's the renewal of the day. It's a new day. So he would roll the sun out like this scarab. And he was also a god of order, creation and order. So the plague of the flies, which is a competing insect, and these flies create chaos rather than order. There's just utter chaos, and there was nothing that Khepri could do anything about the chaos. He couldn't fix it. Then we have the 5th plague, which was against livestock and pestilence, which was on livestock. It was pestilence. This is Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of love and protection. The death of the cattle, which were sacred to Hathor, represented a direct attack on her influence. And then you also had Apis, the sacred bull, who is believed to be the incarnation of the god Ptah. Now, if you remember, after the Egyptians left Egypt, and Moses goes up on the mountain to talk to God, And when he's gone for a while, what do the Israelites do? They go and mold a golden calf. Possibly, this calf, this Egyptian god. They didn't just make a calf, but they made a god that would have had connections with what they were raised knowing and understanding. Because remember, this entire generation grew up in Egypt. They grew up around the worship of all these gods, their culture greatly being impacted, greatly being suppressed. And this is what they knew and what they understood. The sixth plague was boils. This is Sekhmet, the goddess of healing and disease, who could both inflict and cure pestilence. The boils were a physical manifestation of disease that Sekhmet could not prevent. And then we also have Isis, the goddess known for her healing powers, and Thoth, the god of medicine and magic. So none of them were able to do anything about these boils. The Egyptians would have called out to them, help us. And they couldn't stop the boils that Yahweh had plagued them with. The seventh plague was hail and fire. Here we have Nut, the goddess of the sky, who was believed to stretch over the earth. The hail and the fire raining down from the sky would have been an assault on her domain. And then there is also Seth, the god of storms and disorder. I don't know what he is. I'm thinking maybe anteater. It's hard to say. Then there's the eighth plague, which was the locusts. Osiris is a god associated with crops and vegetation, and he was rendered helpless as the locusts destroyed the harvest. Then you had your ninth plague, which was darkness. This was a direct attack on Ra himself. Ra was the preeminent sun god and the most powerful of the Egyptian deities. Ra was like on top of the food chain of all these other gods. And he was the god of the sun. So total darkness was the most profound blow, effectively nullifying the most powerful god in Egypt. And then there was a 10th god, and this came with the 10th plague, which was the death of the firstborn son. Here we have Pharaoh himself. This is actually a statue of Amenhotep. This is supposed to be him. So Pharaoh himself was considered, like I said, as a living god. And the death of his firstborn son was a direct challenge to his divinity and his power. I mean, it's difficult to explain to your followers that you're a god when your child dies and you can't resurrect him. We know our God allowed his child to die on the cross, but he didn't stay dead. Pharaoh's firstborn son stayed dead. Difficult to explain that. Now remember, Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, both of them lost their firstborn. The Exodus account gives understanding to that, informs that, right? Because the firstborn of every house in Egypt, except for those that had the blood from the Passover lamb marked on the doorposts of their home, with the exception of those, every household had death visit their home. And it was these firstborn children that died. Personally, and I can't prove it, I don't have proof, but when you read Exodus and then you know the history, I personally think Thutmose had 2 sons. And he raised those 2 sons, and he was still alive. His second son being Amenhotep. Amenhotep also had a son before Thutmose died. And I believe raised them up, and then this plague of the firstborn happened. Amenhotep lost his older brother, making him now Pharaoh, and he also lost his son. And that this took place. The book of Exodus explains it. Egyptian history tells us that these children died. And it's, I think it's hard to just brush under the rug. You see, God, however, just as he confronted these idols, God still confronts idols today. He confronts idols, and we may not have all of these gods that with all of these strange images that we worship, but even today we still wrestle with idols. We wrestle with the worship of celebrities. We wrestle with the worship of money, the worship of things, something that Jesus compared to being the same as idolatry when he said you can't serve 2 masters. You can't serve God and money. You say, well, we don't see money as being a deity. We don't see money as being a living thing. It doesn't matter. Jesus considered it a competitor for us, for our hearts, as to what we're going to serve. Are we going to serve money, or are we going to serve God? What are we going to chase after in life? What about your own control, worshiping yourself? God still confronts these idols. Now, there are some who are skeptical of whether these plagues actually happened. Some historians, some archaeologists are skeptical. Maybe the plagues never actually happened. Some are even Christians who believe that these stories were just written as kind of a metaphor or a parable for us to learn from, but they're not historical events. However, more archaeology. There exists a papyrus known as the Ipuwer papyrus. What is a papyrus? It's basically paper that the ancient world used to record things on. And this Ipuwer papyrus that they discovered was written in Middle Egyptian hieratic script. It was written by Egyptians, an Egyptian named Ipuwer, hence the name. The date of this, the original, they believe to be right around the same time that they believe the Exodus account would have taken place. So it's a contemporary writing to the time of the Exodus, a writing not written by Hebrews, not written by that, but written by an Egyptian. Now let me read some of it, and I'm going to read the verses from Scripture that correspond with what this Egyptian wrote about. And I copied this, by the way, from a website called Armstrong Institute. So I in no way, I don't want credit for this, but I got this from the Armstrong Institute, and let me just read this. In the Ipuwer papyrus, it says, "Indeed, the river is blood, yet men drink of it." And this is going to be King James, since I copied and pasted. Exodus 7:20, "And all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood." Ipuwer papyrus, "Indeed, hearts are violent, Pestilence is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. Death is not lacking. Exodus 9:15. Surely now I had put forth my hand and smitten thee and thy people with pestilence. 7:19. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt. The papyrus says, indeed, magic spells are divulged. SMW- and SHNW- spells are frustrated because they are remembered by men. I had to ask ChatGPT what in the world that was talking about. ChatGPT interpreted that papyrus for me, and it said that, I'll just read it. Says, the text is lamenting the knowledge which was once secret and controlled by priests or elite scribes has now become common and ineffective. So their magic had become ineffective. Exodus 8:14 and 15, as well as 9:11, says, and the magicians did so with their secret arts to bring forth gnats, but they could not. Then the magicians said unto Pharaoh, this is the finger of God, and the magicians could not stand before Moses. So during the plague of gnats, the magicians had been kind of copying all of the plagues that God had been doing. However, when it came to these gnats, the magicians didn't know how to make gnats. They didn't have a trick for that. There's no sleight of hand to make that happen. And they said, this is the finger of God. The papyrus says, indeed, all animals, their hearts weep, cattle moan because of the state of the land. Exodus 9:3, behold, the hand of the Lord is upon the cattle which are in the field, upon the horses, upon the asses, upon the camels, upon the herds, and upon the flocks. There shall be a very grievous murrain. The papyrus says, behold, the fire has gone up on high. Indeed, gates, columns, and walls are burned up. Exodus 9:23 and 24. And fire ran down under the earth, so there was hail and fire flashing up amidst the hail, very grievous. The papyrus says, towns are destroyed, and upper, which is southern Egypt, has become an empty waste. Exodus 8:18 and 9:26. And I will set apart in that day the land of Goshen, which is northern Egypt, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there. Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, was there no hail. So southern Egypt was struck with this plague of hail. Northern Egypt was spared. The Ipuwer papyrus mentions specifically southern Egypt had become empty and was a waste. The papyrus says, indeed, everywhere barley has perished. Exodus 9:31, and the flax and the barley were smitten. The papyrus even says, the land is without light. Exodus 10:22, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. That's no solar eclipse. Solar eclipses don't last 72 hours. The papyrus says, indeed, every dead person is as a well-born man. Indeed, the children of princes are dashed against walls. Otherwise healthy kids died. Why? Exodus 12:29, the Lord smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on his throne unto the firstborn of the captive. Indeed, this is the the papyrus. Indeed, men are few, and he who places his brother in the ground is everywhere. A lot of people died. Exodus 12:30, there was not a house where there was not one who was dead. The papyrus says, indeed, laughter is perished. It is groaning that is throughout the land. Exodus 12:30, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. See, there's not just the Bible that tells us about these 10 plagues. There's an Egyptian that lived around that time period that wrote about it, wrote about the darkness, wrote about the pestilence, wrote about the dead cattle, wrote about the children being killed in the mourning throughout the land. Moses confronting Pharaoh and God, sending these plagues, brings about the first part of the deliverance from Egypt. We're going to see through this series that God was showing us something much bigger than just delivering people out of Egypt. He was showing us what Jesus was going to do. That Jesus was and is our deliverer. Pharaoh would not only release the Israelites, but he would even send them away with riches. He sent them away with jewelry. He sent them away with livestock. He sent them away with many, many goods. They literally plundered Egypt. And by the way, this also is mentioned in the Ipuwer papyrus. Indeed, poor men have become owners of wealth, and he who could not make sandals for himself is now a possessor of riches. That's Exodus 12:35 says, and the children of Israel asked of the Egyptians jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment. Indeed, gold and lapis, lazuli, silver, and turquoise are strung on the necks of maidservants. That's what the papyrus said. Exodus 11:2 says, every woman borrowed of her neighbor jewels of silver and jewels of gold. The papyrus said, indeed, noblemen are in distress, while the poor man is full of joy. Otherwise, the wealthy people in Egypt, they're upset. But the slaves are overjoyed. Exodus 14:8 said, for the children of Israel went out with a high hand. The papyrus, behold, he who did not know his God now offers to him with incense of another. Otherwise, these Hebrews, they've not been able to worship their God since they've lived here. They've not been able to make sacrifices to their God since they've lived here. And now they're going to get to go, and they're going to be able to make sacrifices to their God, but it's not their sacrifice, it's ours. We gave them the animals that they're now going to go and sacrifice to their God. Exodus 6:3 and 10:25 says, by my name Yahweh, I made me not known to them. And Moses said to Pharaoh, thou must also give into our hands sacrifices and burnt offerings, that we may sacrifice unto the Lord our God. Exactly what this Egyptian wrote and said happened. From the plagues to the Hebrews leaving Egypt, even being given the livestock they needed to make the sacrifices. Here's the thing. Not a single one of those Hebrews had to put up a fight against Pharaoh. Not a single one of the Hebrews had to lift a finger to be delivered. God did the deliverance. He raised up Moses, and through Moses and through God's mighty work, Pharaoh was plundered. And the Israelites were able to leave, and they had everything that they needed in doing so. Things that they did not work for, things that they did not earn, were given to them. Not because of what they did, but because of what God did. God brought it about. Remember, Deuteronomy 18:15 promises a prophet like Moses to come. Moses was sent to deliver Israel from slavery. The future prophet is sent to deliver the world from slavery to sin. To take us away from being slaves to sin to being free from it. Moses spoke God's word. The future prophet, Jesus, is the word of God. Moses led through water to new identity, and we are to be baptized into a new identity in Christ. I've preached on this part before as well, but let me just hit on it quickly. Exodus 12. On the night of Passover, that was the 10th plague, God would go through Egypt and kill the firstborn of every household. That's where I believe Thutmose and Amenhotep lost their children, except those who had a Passover lamb in which the blood was applied to the door frames of their home. This Passover foreshadows the cross, where the blood of Christ would be applied, and we would be spared from death, but rather delivered. See, judgment passes over those who are covered by the blood. Deliverance comes through substitution. The Passover lamb was connected to the future Christ to come. And today we're going to take communion, which is connected to Christ who has already come.